All right. Our next speaker, let me see, is Allison in the room? There you are. Okay, great. Well, come on down. Allison Kanoti is the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring with the Maine Forest Service. She's a graduate of the University of Maine with a Master's of Science in Forestry. And she served in the Maine Forest Service for more than 16 years. First as a forest entomologist and now as the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring. During her time with the service, Allison has coordinated the survey and monitoring for spruce budworm in Maine. She's also managed and administered quarantines and surveys for state quarantine forest insects, and she contacts me regularly with updates on those in that regard. So, Allison, thank you very much for coming and talking with us.
But I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I see it. Okay. Thank you. And also the opportunity today to talk about a native insect for once. And I'm going to start my timer because one of the things that I'm famous for in my family, or infamous for, is going over my time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about spruce budworm today, and I feel like it's probably a familiar insect to most people in this room. But regardless, I'm going to go through a little bit of background, talk about where we are today, where we might be in the future, and if I have time, I'll also touch on a couple of other pests of concern in the state that are not native. So, as I mentioned, spruce budworm is a native moth. That means that it has a whole ton of natural enemies that normally keep its populations at what we call endemic or low levels. And it occasionally escapes those natural enemies. As a caterpillar, it defoliates both fir and spruce species, other conifers as the populations get to be really at the epidemic portion of their life cycle. It does have cyclical populations, and there's probably many in this room that remember the last pretty massive outbreak of spruce budworm in Maine. It has reached those epidemic levels in Maine, leading to both tree growth loss, which isn't talked about as much perhaps as the mortality, so both tree growth loss and mortality 3 times in the last century. And this slide, I'll be completely honest, is probably about 10 years old. And it says, we are at the verge of the next epidemic. And that is as true today as it was 10 years ago. So this shows you that life cycle of spruce budworm. I think folks probably are somewhat familiar with it, but I'll just go through it a little bit. I'm going to start right where we are now, which is down in the right-hand corner there. The overwintering larvae are in hibernaculum right now. And it's interesting because we had talk about climate and climate-smart forestry and carbon and all of that. Well, climate change is going to impact spruce budworm just as it impacts other things in our forest. And that part of the life cycle is going to be one of the things that's most impacted by that. So as we get warmer fall temperatures, the spruce budworm is in a dormant state. It has a very low metabolic rate. But with warmer fall temperatures, that metabolic rate is going to be higher. And so it's going to go through its resources more quickly than it would during normal climate in our state. So this generation of foresters is going to be reacting and hopefully planning for a spruce budworm epidemic. The next generation of foresters in Maine, maybe not. So it's just something to be aware of. So after the larvae go through the overwinter, if it's warmer, they maybe aren't surviving that winter as well, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but it's true. They emerge from that dormant state in the spring. They begin feeding, first mining in buds and needles, and then chewing bites through the needles themselves as they get larger. They pupate in early summer on the branches of those host trees, and then they fly as moths in sort of that midsummer period. And one of the things that folks remember is the red foliage of those epidemics. You get these partially chewed needles hanging onto trees. The trees turn red around the edges. It smells like Christmas in the woods. You're in the middle of a spruce budworm epidemic, and we aren't there yet in Maine. So as I mentioned, the populations are cyclical, and this is kind of a complicated graph, and it's a little bit bizarre how the different metrics are represented there, but it gets them all there on the same page. So shaded in gray is the defoliation of spruce budworm over time, beginning in 1955 through last year. And last year's defoliation doesn't really show on this graph. It was too small to show on this graph. And that's in millions of acres. In the dashed green line is the catch of adult moths, both male and female, in our light traps. And we've been operating those light traps for decades with cooperators. And so you can see how those light trap catches kind of track the defoliation that we see in the state. And then in the solid green is the pheromone traps. And those didn't really come into use until the collapse of the last outbreak. And what we saw beginning in 2013 is a growth in those trap catch numbers, both in the pheromone traps and in the light traps. But before we go there, I'm going to cover a little bit about the that gray that's shown on the map or on the graph, and just show you some of the maps of the defoliation of the past outbreaks of spruce budworm. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. Begins in 1955. These data come from both the weed report and also from Maine Forest Service annual reports. And you can see defoliation growing through the 50s, kind of hopscotching across the landscape. And we had defoliation nearly every year for decades. Defoliation was mapped. Here we get into the 70s, 72, 73, 74, 75, one of the biggest years. And then eventually, we get to the point where the populations really start to collapse. And I'll say that in Maine, our records from the Maine Forest Service show no observations of the late instar larvae, the larger caterpillars in the state after the early 90s. We just didn't really see them in any of our surveys after that time. The natural enemies were still finding them. They're really good at finding spruce budworm. The pheromone traps still caught the males. The pheromone's very strong. It draws those males in very, very well from those low endemic populations. But people weren't seeing them on the landscape. So what do these late instar larvae look like? This shows you both the feeding damage. You can see those reddened needles. These pictures come from the North Shore of Quebec, where you used to have to go to see spruce budworm damage. And then you could see it on the South Shore. And now you can see it in Maine if you got good eyes. And then you can see the larva down there on the right, sort of a greenish brown caterpillar with spots, fairly hairless, not really hairless, but fairly hairless. It appears kind of hairless to the casual observer. You can see the pupa here, and then the adult itself. And sometimes we know the adults show up in great numbers. They will be picked up through what's called atmospheric transport. As the adults rise from the canopy, they can be picked up by air currents and carried to new places. And we see the impacts of that in Maine in our trap catches. And this shows pictures from the Matapedia Valley in Gaspé Peninsula from about 6 years ago. You can see the impacts of spruce budworm feeding and just that reddening of the outer foliage on the branches of the trees. In this case, it was fairly moderate feeding damage. And that's in Quebec, where they employ a foliage protection strategy for spruce budworm damage. So when that first slide was made 10 years ago, I think that Maine Forest Service was saying, we're going to see defoliation within 5 years, right? 2013, we first had those higher trap catches, and the prediction was we're going to see defoliation in 5 years. And I will say I was very careful when I started to work with spruce budworm and the cooperators in the pheromone trap network, I really don't think that we really have a situation where the past is really prologue. I don't think that we're in a place where we can say, based on our past experience, with something that is so influenced by the conditions in both temperature and our forest composition. We can't just look at the past and say what's going to happen in the current situation. And so what I do know is that we are in a point where our populations are building. We're at a point where we are no longer getting zeros as our averages, or 0 to 5 as our averages in the traps that we use to monitor spruce budworm. So we are kind of outside of that stable phase of the population and into that growing phase. And so from the question of where it is coming, from a biological perspective, spruce budworm is always here. It's a native insect. As I mentioned, those natural enemies are really good at finding it and usually keep it below the levels where we as humans are able to find it. From a silvicultural perspective, as you're implementing practices on the ground, the time for treatments is ongoing and should be from the last outbreak. It's decades where you have opportunity to plan and reduce your exposure to damage and loss from spruce budworm. So from a silvicultural perspective, it should be considered the time is here. The next thing I have on there, from an early intervention strategy perspective, the time for monitoring has been here for at least a decade, and the time for management in Maine has also started. So what is the early intervention strategy? It's a research approach to managing spruce budworm that's implemented in Atlantic Canada, and it uses biological pesticides to keep spruce budworm populations below the threshold of outbreak. So we're really lucky with spruce budworm. We have really sensitive monitoring tools. They include not only the pheromone trap network, but also overwintering larval surveys. In the last epidemic, we were also doing surveys for later instar larvae and pupae. We've really gone away from that and are just doing the L2 and the pheromone trapping. And in Maine, we, in the last 2 years, have had sites that have exceeded that threshold where budworm can escape those natural enemies. And so we do have landowners or a landowner who has been treating the landscape in those areas where the populations are growing beyond that outbreak threshold. So the last bullet there, from the threshold of when is it going to match the 70s, the memories of the 70s and 80s? The answer is probably never. Our forest is a lot different. I expect that we will see both tree damage and mortality without intervention with spruce budworm, but I don't expect that we're going to see something that matches the memories of those who were there when budworm was last large in Maine. I mean, we still may be using a bucket loader to move moths from underneath the lights. We've seen that not too far away from us in New Brunswick when some of those flights come through atmospheric transport. But I don't expect that we're going to see a budworm outbreak of the 70s here in Maine. So again, I wanted to come back to this graphic. Most of the folks I work with really don't like it, but I really like it. I think it shows well where we are. We have that defoliation curve, and as I alluded to earlier, we did have some of our first defoliation in Maine in recent years. And then that trap curve, and I will again be completely honest and say that that trend line is just what Excel will throw in there if you tell it to throw in a trend line, an exponential trend line. But we can see that the pheromone trap catches, those light trap catches, went from basically 0 to above 0 and have stayed above 0 for a number of years, since 2013. And what happened in 2013 was we had one of those atmospheric transport events, or perhaps more than one, that brought moths in from the North Shore and augmented the population that we have in Maine. And we've been having that not every year, but on a semi-regular basis since that time. So I want to look back at that 2013 year. So 2013 was the first notable increase in moth catches. We kept those moths. We sent them off to researchers who were looking at the mites on the moths, and they were able to determine from the mite species on the moths that they actually came from the Quebec population. So we know that those were migrants for the most part coming into Maine traps, not moths that grew up locally. In 2014, a number of you in this room joined us in a more intensive monitoring for spruce budworm. So prior to 2014, from the early 1990s onward, we had partners in Irving and the Penobscot Indian Nation and the U.S. Forest Service who were monitoring spruce budworm populations using pheromone traps along with us. And beginning in 2014, that list of cooperators grew to more than 20 different organizations. And that's continued to this day. In 2020, that was a great year, right? We had our first confirmed report of the larger caterpillars since the early 90s. What didn't go wrong in 2020? There's probably a short list, but there was a lot that was kind of going wrong in 2020. We also had the first noticeable defoliation from the ground. So the image on the bottom there is defoliation that was quantified by our technician in northern Maine. The defoliation and the larger caterpillars were actually first noted by our partners at UMFK. Neil Thompson, in particular, was one that brought it to our attention. In 2021, we had the first noticeable damage from the air, and it was about 800 acres of damage. I can't even really call it defoliation. It was there, at a very trace level, but it was really only visible from the air with a trained eye. You had to know what you were looking for, and as far as looking for that defoliation. We also had the first insecticide treatment following the early intervention strategy using BTK applied from the air. And there was the first in-state L2 processing at a University of Maine CFRU-funded facility. And that's something that we know is an important aspect of our monitoring program if people are going to follow an early intervention strategy for managing spruce budworm. You absolutely need to do the L2 monitoring because you need to know what that local population is, and you need results that come in on a efficient basis, I will say. We need results before March in order to plan those air operations if they are going to happen, in order to do the delimiting that needs to be done before the air operations are planned. You need those earlier results. In this last year, we had 2 locations with the early intervention strategy treatments applied. One was in sort of northwestern Maine, and one was in northeastern Maine. We had an overall lighter impact observed than in 2021. A lot of theories out there as to what might have happened. If folks remember, around the 14th of May, we had temperatures in the 90s in Aroostook County, pretty unusual. Caterpillars are out there feeding at that time. We did see a fair amount of caterpillar activity, but just not the amount of defoliation we would have expected with that level of caterpillar activity earlier in May. So we did not actually map any defoliation from the air in 2022, and we were able to see some from the ground, take folks out to see what it looked like, to help us to map the damage. So again, we see still these huge fluctuations in trap catches, but they haven't gone back to those low levels that they were in the 90s and early 2000s. We see in-flights now and again from Canada. The last one of significance was, I believe, in 2020. And these are well modeled by our Canadian cooperators across the border. And in the region, there's a different, a patchwork of approaches for management of spruce budworm. So in Quebec, they've had an outbreak for more than 20 years now, I believe. And they are applying a foliage protection strategy where they treat a very small percentage of the defoliated area with pesticides, BTK in the case of Quebec as well, because of limitations on what they can apply. It's also a very good product for managing budworm. They protect a small proportion of the commercial forest that's going to be harvested in the near term. In New Brunswick and other parts of Atlantic Canada, including Newfoundland, they are doing applications of BTK, another product with the active ingredient of tebufenazide, another biological that's fairly specific to caterpillars, and also a very small pheromone mating disruption trial as well. They are applying these in sort of what they call a whack-a-mole approach, where they go out and try to suppress these building populations as they pop up on the landscape. And so that does require, in that case, a lot of public support, as well as a very intensive monitoring system. Oh, I had some more slides. So there's the Quebec defoliation. It has the 2021. I don't have the 2022 data there, but you can see they had a slight drop in 2021 of acres mapped. And that map there in the middle kind of shows one of the models of that atmospheric transport, just showing what can happen when the moths are carried long distances on those currents. And then in Atlantic Canada, they've had those treatments, and those are sort of the green and purple on the maps. And we are lucky that the province of Newfoundland has borne the brunt of the atmospheric transport of moths in recent years, and not the state of Maine. And so there's more information on that early intervention approach, and also about spruce budworm at sprucebudwormmaine.org. That's a website that's hosted by Aaron Weiskettel's group, the CRSF, and is part of the Spruce Budworm Task Force effort. And I have about 10 minutes left. I want to touch on two of the more concerning invasive pests that we have here in Maine. They've been sort of behaving badly in recent years. I just wanted to touch on them briefly. And then actually I have a third one as well. So first, emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer was detected in the state in 2018. It's one of those things that went wrong before 2020. And there is a state quarantine on ash resulting from that detection of emerald ash borer. There is no longer a federal quarantine on emerald ash borer, but we are still looking at a huge percentage of our ash resource that's not infested by emerald ash borer, and so that's why we have a quarantine in place. We have two centers of infestation in Maine, a very rapidly growing southern center and a more slowly growing northern center of infestation. And the image all the way on the left there shows a blonded tree in western York County. It's becoming a more frequent sight here in Maine. And the blonding happens when woodpeckers go after the larvae beneath the bark of the ash trees. And I'll say that the infestation that was recently detected in Waterville was detected as a result of that blonding. You can go up I-95, you go past the exit that Martins is at, and then you keep an eye out on your right, and you'll see that the blonded trees resulting from emerald ash borer feeding. So it's a good sign to be aware of and to be on the lookout for, especially in the winter months when they go after the larvae underneath the bark will litter the snow, and you can actually see that at highway speed as well. So just be aware of that particular sign. So just some more images from damage in Maine. We have Lebanon, Alfred, Westbrook. Those are the pictures from those areas. And I'll say that these are a couple of years old now, and the damage is just continuing to accumulate. As I mentioned, there is a quarantine, and there is also emergency order. The emergency order covers spaces that were recently detected, including that site around Waterville, and also in Lewiston, Auburn area. And then the next one I wanted to just touch on is hemlock woolly adelgid. And I'll say that the natural spread of hemlock woolly adelgid has been off the charts in recent years. And I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that because of the number of reports we've had of people with blackened feet on the beaches of Maine, and also a report from a boater in Massachusetts in June of 2021, where he noticed these insects raining out of the sky for more than 24 hours while he was on his boat. And those insects are pictured in the lower right there. There's a beach sample in the cup up above. What was blackening the feet of people on the beaches of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts were the dead bodies of hemlock woolly adelgid. They're not only the dead bodies, they were dead bodies of the winged form of hemlock woolly adelgid, which forms in the summer when the populations are dense. So you get more winged adelgid when the populations are densest. And so this is evidence of just years of buildup of that population due to sort of moderate winters that we've had. And so the graph here shows winter mortality of hemlock woolly adelgid. The green line is about where you would expect to see mortality if you had a stable population of hemlock woolly adelgid. Beneath that line, the populations can be expected to be building, and above that line, they can be expected to be growing. And so you can see we've had a number of years where we've documented low overwintering mortality of hemlock woolly adelgid. Anybody who works in coastal Maine, from the mid-coast down to York County, has seen the results of these building populations. The hemlock is just in really rough shape. The droughts that we've had for a number of growing seasons isn't helping at all because hemlock woolly adelgid causes hemlock to lose its ability to really closely regulate its water use. And so it's really concerning from the standpoint of wildlife, but also the long-term role of hemlock in our forests, especially in coastal and near coastal Maine. We did have a couple of new detections of hemlock woolly adelgid in 2022, including in Bradbury State Park in Pownell, in the town of Whitefield, and also in North Haven, Whitefield, representing an inland detection of that pest on an Atlantic salmon river. So just something to consider is hemlock can be extremely important to our cold water fisheries, and those cold water fisheries are going to begin to be impacted by the decline of hemlock sooner rather than later. I just want to mention in the important life stage of hemlock woolly adelgid, or life stages, are the eggs and the crawlers. These are the two stages of the insect that you can move on your equipment, on your clothing, and basically can move off of rooted hemlock. Everything else needs to move on rooted hemlock. It's sessile. It's married to that place where it settles once it settles as a crawler. And so if you can avoid doing hemlock operations between March and July, you can help to reduce the spread of this pest and reduce the risk of introduction of it. So just a heads up that if you're in hemlock stands, if you can avoid between March and July. If you're in hemlock stands during that time of year, you'll have crawlers and eggs potentially raining down from those trees. And inside of each of those red circles, there are actually more than one crawler. So they're really tiny, like specks of dust. And then finally, insect that everybody loves to hate, brown-tailed moth. I just want to briefly touch on some kind of good news from that pest. I won't go through the history because I'm running short on time, but here's the defoliation history of brown-tailed moth recently. You can see from 1994 to 2021, we didn't actually have a year with zero defoliation mapped from a fixed-wing plane of brown-tailed moth. It's always over 400 acres. In 2021, we had almost 200,000 acres of defoliation caused by brown-tailed moth mapped. And in 2022, we had a large collapse in the core area of the population. We would not have predicted that because the weather was not conducive to disease, which is what causes these widespread collapse. The disease really needs that wet spring weather. Conventional wisdom needs that wet spring weather in order to proliferate. However, last summer, the summer before last, we started to see these early instar larvae dead on the webs that they were creating. And so it appears that the disease was able to take hold in that wet July that we had last year. And particularly in the capital region, we saw a real collapse of populations. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that it's not there to the same extent as it was the prior year. So I expect we'll have a lot fewer than that 198,000 acres of brown-tailed moth damage mapped next year. I expect folks in that greater capital region to have some relief from the pest. And I think of it like a ring of fire. So outside of that region, you can expect to have still exposure to those hairs, that burning rash, all that great stuff. Right now, I'm in the Bangor region. We're in a very heavy region for area for brown-tailed moth populations. We see the skeletonizing damage really showing up in that region right now. Same thing around Lewis and Auburn. So like I said, kind of a ring of fire around that core population. And yeah, you probably are aware of the hairs and the rash that it can cause. And I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to skip right to my last slide and encourage you to visit our website, maine.gov/forest health. There you can sign up for the conditions reports. If you really like to hear bad news, you can sign up for brown tail updates, and you can sign up for information on emerald ash borer.
You know, I love brown-tailed moth from a policy point of view because it's a bug and it irritates people and they want to do something about it. So it helps us with our cause with spruce budworm and bugs in other parts of the state. So it's not necessary.
So Dr. Meck at the University of Maine is doing some trials with different formulations of BTK. What we found in the last outbreak is the commercially available formulations weren't terrific in controlling it. And part of the reason is that your action threshold is pretty low, whereas budworm, you don't have to worry about killing so many of them. With brown-tailed moth, for some individuals, like 10 webs, a density of about 10 webs per tree can be enough to cause rash. And if you're only killing off like 60% of the population, it's really not enough to provide relief to people. Brown tail can cause some issues, especially with drought and other defoliators with tree health, but the main concern is really human nuisance, human health.